As you know, research. Research is a major focus here at the GSD. And so this is a very important discussion for us. Research grounds us in the realities and the exigencies of the various environments within which we are called upon to work. We aspire to critically engage in and understand the potential impact of our buildings, landscapes, urban design, and plans on the communities and cities across the globe. The purple chair is moving. Our research spans a breadth of concerns conceptually, formally, theoretically, historically, environmentally, activating the imagination and creative potential of design. This next session will be a bit different from what you have seen so far. Each presentation will be offered pecha kucha style, meaning that each speaker gets just a maximum of 2 slides and 5 minutes to speak. We will... More slides? Ooh, okay, it's gotten longer. We will then have a few minutes for Q&A. Antoine Picon is our moderator. He is the Travelsted Professor of History of Architecture and Technology. Antoine.
Thank you, Grace. It seems you've said it all, but nevertheless, just wanted to say very quickly a few words about research. The first thing probably to note that research has known a spectacular development at the GSD in the past years. To give you an idea, in less than 5 years, the research income of the school has been multiplied by a factor something like 16. In addition to the structures that existed before that evolution, new ones have been added, such as 7 design labs, as well as the brand new Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities. So research has definitely acquired a new momentum. Above all, its nature and scope has changed. To make a long story short, one could say that on the one hand, research in a school like the GSD is more and more intellectually ambitious, connected to the academic world at large. On the other hand, research is also directly plugged into large questions raised by society that often present immediate practical consequences. Among these questions, let me mention, for instance, the future of cities or the quest for sustainability. At the GSD, researchers are definitely grounded visionaries. So how to be both scientifically ambitious and relevant on a practical standpoint? How to contribute to the core knowledge of disciplines such as architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, and design, while addressing pressing concrete issues. These challenges among those that must be met at the GSD. Another challenge has to do with a great number of problems investigated in a school like this one, and the diversity of methods mobilized for that purpose. Methods that range from the humanities to science and technology, and from the social sciences to design. That said, this diversity of themes and method represents also a major asset. Research and the active participation of faculty and students to the investigations led at the school offer an opportunity to rethink and better articulate the various components of design education. So in order to give you an idea of the research currently led at the GSD and the perspective that it opens, 6 of my colleagues will present some of their current investigation. So I will be relatively short in my introduction now. I will introduce them all one after the other, since the conference booklets give a number of details on their rich trajectories. The presentation themselves, it has been said by Grace, will be short, but despite the fact that they have 5 minutes, they'll be able to talk 15 slides, but they do have 5 minutes to present. So our first speaker will be Anne Forsyth. Anne Forsyth is Professor of Urban Planning and Director of the Urban Planning Program at the GSD. Anne's research addresses the complex issues behind the ambition to make city more sustainable and healthy. And the title of her contribution will be Health and Place. Our second speaker will be Michael Hooper, who is Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the GSD and Director of the Social Agency Lab. His research focuses on land use, housing and urbanization, and he will be talking about international development in the age of urbanization. Jane Hutton, who will be next, is an assistant professor in landscape architecture at the GSD, where she also co-directs the Energy, Environments and Design Research Lab. Her work addresses the dimension of material practice in landscape architecture, and the title of her presentation is Material Landscape, Specifying Design. Ali Malkawi is Professor of Architectural Technology at the GSD and founding director of the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities that I evoked earlier. He conducts research in the domain of building simulation, energy conservation, and sustainability in buildings, and he will be talking about research in green buildings and cities. Farshid Moussavi is an architect, professor in practice of architecture at the GSD. In addition to her practice, she is investigating some of the fundamentals of contemporary design, not in the same sense as RAM, but definitely fundamentals. As a result of this investigation, she has published 2 books, respectively, on the function of ornament and the function of structure. And today she will present on the function of aesthetics in architecture. Finally, Andrew Witt is a designer and assistant professor in practice at the GSD. His research revolves around the relation between rigorous approach to form, such as those that are mathematically based, digital technology, and new fabrication techniques. And he will talk about matter, form, and material of form logics. So please join me in welcoming our presenters, beginning with the first of them, Anne Forsyth.
I have a few extra seconds. For a number of years, I've been thinking about the varying ways that we do research, not only in terms of topics and methods, but what I call the cultures of making a contribution. And this has shaped my own work on healthy places. But first, I need to talk about what is research. Research answers wider questions using systematic, repeatable methods, but most importantly, it's made public so that it is possible to not only critique the products of research, but also the process of conducting it. But if you were to ask the general public about what is research, they would likely answer that research is something like answering questions on the scientific frontier. Those working in this area are in big teams looking at highly focused questions, producing many short products that incrementally build up knowledge. These are well-funded teams in a highly competitive world. In my own work, I've investigated the connection between place and physical activity. By now, I've looked at thousands of people using surveys, motion detectors, urban design audits, mapping. I've read the studies of hundreds of other people, and for example, in the area of density, I can say that higher density environments lead more people to do travel walking. But it's very hard to use place to increase total physical activity, in part because if people walk more for transportation, they'll do less dancing in the streets. Place is not really a panacea. The next group go a little bit further into practice, using multi-methods or summarizing previous research to create timely implementable results. This is funded often by governments and nonprofits, and the emphasis is on action. I, for example, reviewed hundreds of studies on how to increase walking and cycling for transportation. And I can say for transportation, urban form matters for walking, infrastructure for cycling, pricing is key, and the places that manage to increase walking and cycling overall use a lot of methods all at once. This is the story of the Netherlands. But there are areas where we don't know very much that may be actually more important. For instance, the importance of social supports in walking and cycling or education. The next group of work it moves on from these practical applications to actually look back at practice and reflect on it, either one's own practice or looking more historically at cases. This is work that's often highly qualitative and done by individuals. For example, I've spent a number of decades looking at large-scale planned communities that try to use multiple methods to build up comprehensive approaches to making areas more sustainable and healthy. I've been particularly interested at competing visions of what it is to make those good cities. For example, the high-density, walkable eco-city much favoured by planners and architects versus the lower-density, biophilic, close-to-nature eco-burb that's valued by landscape architects as an approach to sustainable and healthy cities. The two camps accuse each other of being unsustainable and unhealthy, but actually what is the case is they just vary in terms of what they think it should be sustained. Finally, our enduring questions. These are the questions that are beyond any one field or discipline. These are the larger questions like what makes a good city, what is a just community. Answering these is often the work of a lifetime. I've been grappling with the question of what it is to make a healthy place. What is the connection between healing and the metropolis? This is a complicated question because there are many connections between people, health, and places, from air quality and social connectedness through food access and mental well-being. But what is it to heal? What is health? What can heal the metropolis? So finally, when you ask these big questions, what makes our fields different to the traditional definitions is we ask not only what is happening and perhaps why is it happening, but how can we actually make a difference? And in the area of health and place, making a difference is literally of vital importance.
Hello, my name is Michael Hooper. The theme for my talk today is international development in the age of urbanization, and I'll be exploring this through work I've been doing in Haiti on the politics of reconstruction. I'll be highlighting what I think is an important opportunity for the kinds of spatial research we do here at the GSD to inform other disciplines and practices. My interest in post-disaster reconstruction began when, just after Haiti faced its massive earthquake in 2010, I began to receive plans for response and reconstruction. I was struck that time and time again, longer-term plans for rebuilding had a largely rural focus. They often involved moving people to the urban fringe or to the countryside entirely. The more I looked, the stronger this rural focus appeared. The Haitian government proposed 6 new cities in the countryside, while others advocated for a move away from the informal, dense, congested environment of the capital. This was fascinating because one of the great themes of past disasters is the tendency towards on-site reconstruction. To give you a sense of some of the plans proposed, I've collected some images. Here you can see the plan for Harvest City, a floating community off the seemingly green rolling hills of Haiti. This plan, like many others, focused on agrarian economies, rural lifestyles, and this is fascinating because many of the displaced were urban residents of a dynamic metropolis. Here you can see plans for the very aptly named Garden City. The designers note explicitly that they worked outside Port-au-Prince due to the ease of working in unoccupied areas. Which reminds me of a quote we discovered in our research where a policymaker said they wanted to move people to the countryside. There was only one hurdle. They couldn't think of a single reason why someone would want to move there. Media reports emerging after the quake also provided a very interesting glimpse of the kind of thinking that was informing reconstruction. The UN Special Envoy said, if we don't do anything, Port-au-Prince will grow and become an incubator for crime and violence. And Stephen Hall said, rather than build in Port-au-Prince, we can speed things up if we build outside existing cities. So together, these plans and narratives suggested that it could be very fruitful to better understand what drives decision-making around reconstruction. In Haiti, is there really a tendency to favor reconstruction outside the dynamic urban hub of Port-au-Prince? And if so, why? So these were questions we sought to answer through field research in Haiti. Over the summer and fall of 2012, our team, which included many GSD students, conducted detailed interviews with 48 organizations working on post-disaster rebuilding and reconstruction. These range from the largest organizations, UN agencies, to the smallest, small Haitian local NGOs. And to summarize, we found that the largest proportion of interviewees did indeed favor reconstruction outside the city. But why would organizations focus their efforts away from the economic, social, and political heart of the country, which will also likely be the site of all or most future urban growth and migration? The answers can be seen when we look at the results in a little bit more detail. In fact, two very different takes on reconstruction emerged. The first is the one I've mentioned: reconstruction should happen outside the city. In contrast, a smaller number of interviewees argued for urban rebuilding. They argued that social networks, jobs, infrastructure already existed in the city and that future people would move there as well, so it made sense to prepare in the city for that growth. But there was a very clear divide between organizations who held non-urban versus urban positions. Large, international development-focused organizations advocated for non-urban rebuilding, while local Haitian NGOs and smaller organizations advocated for urban rebuilding. Also, the non-urban actors had much bigger budgets and much more political clout. So why might this difference in organizations exist? Our interviews suggest that international development actors are simply defaulting to their traditional rural focus. International development began as a rural practice and has maintained that center of gravity. Problematically, the fixation on rural reconstruction is likely to only worsen conditions in Port-au-Prince. Which brings me to my concluding point, which is that there is tremendous opportunity for the kinds of spatial thinking that are the hallmarks of the GSD to inform other fields, such as international development. But there's much to be done, and I can perhaps show this with an anecdote. When I joined a PhD seminar some years ago at another university, I was asked to tell my research interests, to which I said, the politics of space. To my chagrin, I was told that I should immediately talk to someone in the aerospace engineering department to pursue that. I then had to say, well, not the politics of outer space, space here on Earth. And they said, oh, well, that's a lot less interesting. So I tell this because there's a huge opportunity for us to speak not only to other architects, planners, landscape architects, but also to engage with a wide range of other critically important fields, of which international development is one, to ensure that spatial issues and the urban realities of our age are taken into consideration when designing policies that affect the lives of millions of people. Thank you.
Hello. There we go. I'm interested in the materials that designers specify to make landscapes and buildings, and in the ecological, social, and political conditions of their making. These materials are fragments of distant forests, quarries, and factories, yet they're abstracted from these landscapes through processes of commodification. Material differences produce very specific environmental conditions were installed. Oh, there we go. For example, here the reflectance of a black versus a white roof shingle, the porosity of pavement, or the soil retention of a vegetated surface, and this is typically what designers were interested in. At the same time, these conditions are amplified at the scale of the city and beyond. Materials are temporally bound as infrastructure, parks, and buildings, and continue to move through demolition and processes of erosion. They interact with other ecological processes and produce the metabolism of the city, as this study of Brussels starts to account for. Global capitalism moves materials around the world based on differential labor, environmental and transportation costs, and produces conditions of unequal ecological exchange. While these extraction, processing, and transfer sites and the people who operate them are fundamental to urbanization, they are largely invisible and typically outside of our purview. The construction industry has developed a range of mechanisms for evaluating the impacts and sources of building materials. These are really, really important, but they're by necessity very reductive. Rather than emphasizing best practice material selection, I'm specifically interested in the potential of understanding material cycles as contiguous with and generative for design. So my starting point has been to trace a set of materials that ended up in significant landscapes in New York City over the past 150 years. In each case, I'm looking at the reciprocal relationships between a production site and the landscape architecture project in question. Frederick Law Olmsted specified a range of fertilizers in Central Park, including horse manure, night soil, and Peruvian guano, which indexed the metabolic underpinnings of late 19th century urbanization. Guano revolutionized agriculture with its rich nutrient content and triggered the development of synthetic fertilizers, which are the basis of today's global food system. Millions of granite blocks were cut from the archipelagos of Maine and were reassembled in the streets of New York City to facilitate a new hardened landscape of mobility. In response to egregious working conditions, Vinyl Haven granite cutters unionized and joined in solidarity with longshoremen and paving layers in New York City. Robert Moses's campaign to revitalize New York City's streets in the early 1950s included the establishment of a large-scale tree nursery in the jail on Rikers Island. For 2 decades, inmates produced a continuous supply of primarily plane trees, to streets and parks throughout the boroughs. Ipe lumber, used in Phase 1 of the High Line, is the most popular tropical hardwood for American landscape construction. Its slow growth and habit makes it extremely desirable, very rot-resistant, and valuable. Its high value and sparse ecological habit have exacerbated patterns of legal and illegal deforestation in the Amazon. Following these historical cases, I'm interested in how an understanding of the expanded material cycles might play out in contemporary modes of design. With colleagues in the Energy, Environment, and Design Lab, Kiel Mo and Daniel Ibanez, and the Wood Innovation Center in Santiago, we're initiating a study about the relationship between wood construction and wood landscapes. So this is timely because of a growing global interest in wood as a key construction material, given its renewability and ability to sequester carbon. At the same time, we need to examine the landscape implications of this agenda and consider them as constitutive to wood design. If we maintain a generic understanding of wood and simply just build with a lot of it, we reproduce and exacerbate existing conditions. So instead, we're interested in specifying wood, in designing with wood in ways that support ecologically complex landscapes and just working conditions. We're looking at cases in Massachusetts and central Chile, where efforts to build local culture of selectively harvested forests in the name of conservation and cooperative economies are underway. The final image shows a set of native Chilean woods, which are currently underutilized and threatened by the dominance of subsidized monoculture plantations in the country. Their exquisite colors, textures, and densities catalog the diversity of forests themselves. They call for new design thinking which could link projects with the biophysical specificities of their making. While these extended material relationships are typically considered external to our disciplines, I believe that they're fundamental to more materially exuberant, ecologically copacetic, and just modes of design. Thank you.
Greetings. Today I will speak about our research in green buildings and cities. Interest in this area has prompted the creation of the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities, a new rapidly expanding research entity at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. The mission of the center is to transform the building industry by investigating the role that the building efficiency plays in the larger urban context of sustainability. While focusing on the issues of sustainability and green, the center will work to shift away from a set of engineering-dominated processes to design-driven solutions within the boundaries of an ecological approach that would allow our solutions to be related to and inspired by ecosystems. In short, the Center for Green Buildings and Cities will drive sustainability through design. Our research will span different scales, from the nano to the urban, material to the city, and the in-between. In addition, research topics will strongly consider the effect of carbon emissions and the issues associated with the growing environmental crisis. In order to establish a research platform, we have embraced the process of a living lab, which in conjunction with our collaborative multidisciplinary approach will enable us to better define key questions, initiate research, and test and apply ideas within a highly interactive settings. This living lab will act as the center's research and administrative headquarters. The structure will inhabit is a pre-1940s building, of which there are almost 14 million homes in the United States similar to it. Through this retrofit, our goal is to develop new, highly innovative technologies and test them outside current industry standards. Embodied energy is also incorporated into this net zero approach, and the intention is to produce enough energy to account for the emissions produced as a result of the retrofit, manufacturing, transportation, and construction. We have already actually established hundreds of different studies that have allowed us to explore various ideas. These studies allowed us to better define the ways, the most pressing questions, address them over a long term, as well as ultimately catalyze innovations that can revolutionize the built environment. We have decided to attack these goals through 4 key research dimensions: design and operation, life cycle design through high performance material and construction, technology diffusion and adaptation, and sustainability planning. These categories relate to 4 simple pillars that we call them material, modeling, economic, and urban. These categories also relate to a fundamental question that we are engaged with, which is building a database that would allow the center to be a facts-based center. I will now very quickly present some quick examples of the ongoing projects within these 4 research domains. In modeling, we are shifting the discussion from simulation-only research, which looks at the world in a very idealistic fashion, to data-driven models that would enable us to look into the actual performance of our built environment. We will also explore building models for urban environments and manage the most probably pressing issue, which is uncertainties associated with those settings. We also go so far as to study components within buildings, including sensors and fault diagnostics, as well as fault diagnostics, which also manage uncertainties using similar data-driven models. We are engaged with materials-related research that focuses on 3 main issues: design for disassembly as a start, vented materials, as well as embodied energy. This is the beginning of many different studies that we'll be engaged with. In addition, through the economic dimension, the center will engage with many different issues. We will be studying the rate of technological change in the building industry and the factors that influence technological adoption and diffusion. Cost-benefit studies will assess the potential results for companies that adopt new technologies to improve building performance. Other studies will suggest how improvement of labor-related performance might also influence the green building industry. Finally, we are looking into alternative modes through which we can interact with our buildings. Some people spoke about that today in varieties of different formats. What I mean by alternative modes in this particular instance, alternative interfaces to be precise. This research is exploring technology's potential to extend the human experience and enhance our perception in areas such as thermal comfort. Thank you so much.
Hi. Since 2005, my seminars and studios at the GST have investigated the function or agency of aesthetics in architecture. The seminars have focused on 3 concepts of ornament, form, and style, and the studios have investigated the materiality of built forms that include physical elements such as roofs, envelopes, structure, as well as non-physical materials such as time or techniques such as tessellation. Rem Koolhaas has stated, and I quote him, "No architect in their right mind would dare to write today an elements of architecture that intended to describe both what the components of architecture are and how they should be put together. But the architect's role is to put elements together in a certain way. Refuting the notion of finding ideals, such as the 5 points of architecture, does not mean abandoning the question of how and why architects assemble elements. How then can architects make a difference in people's daily lives? After all, tying ourselves around a tree or sticking a solar panel on a building are not architectural ways to make a difference to people's thinking about the environment or the economy. The function research investigates the assembly of architectural material as the core of an architect's agency. It investigates how using the practical matters of daily life as the raw materiality of architecture grounds the assembly of buildings and therefore their aesthetic experience in everyday life rather than the search for ideals. Each built form that serves a daily life use comprises of a myriad of elements that can be assembled differently. There are also numerous experts that provide the architect with diverse inputs Nevertheless, it is the architect that assembles all those elements into a coherent form and determines what is audible or inaudible, traversable and not traversable, visible or invisible, touchable or untouchable, closed or open, fixed or movable, transparent or opaque, and the colors, geometries, and structures which are present, and in doing so determines the aesthetic presence of built forms, the cluster of affects that spreads directly out of their thisness, and which does not represent anything. It is autotelic and cannot signify any specific meaning in the sense of communication. Rather, it exists like a language prior to words, which individuals will perceive not as facts, but as a thing in the world, which making sense of it in a particular context will create tacit knowledge and unthought associations, which in turn influence the way people think and act in relationship to their everyday life around them and the different meanings they attribute to it. Built forms may not signify anything, but there is no doubt that they are a platform to people who encounter them, especially since they are always experienced in the context of a specific activity or use. As they are repeated over time, certain conventions of assembly evolve and lead to habits of behavior in the people who use them, such as, for example, here in the habits of behavior prompted in people by this arrangement of seats in a cinema as opposed to this one. This arrangement is not a more ideal way to watch a film. Rather, by creating a break from the conventional way of watching a movie in a cinema, even at a micro scale, it frees people from a way of perceiving the cinema which has become so habitual that it seems almost inevitable. The style research investigates this as the agency of architects, how by reconfiguring conventions of arrangements, architects can generate new encounters between people and daily life and invite them to form new assemblages with them, the experience of which leads to their perception, understanding, or know-how. For example, rather than simply passing through a ferry terminal, people might use it as a place to sit down and paint. The architect's role is not to determine or design an ideal ferry terminal, which is impossible since each individual will perceive it and experience it differently, but rather by disrupting conventions associated with such a building to free them to creatively respond to it rather than simply habitually react. So too, the architect's role cannot be to determine an ideal way for people to use their private balconies, but rather by changing conventional arrangements in such buildings, disrupt habits of using such private outdoor spaces, or through the play between the conventions of arrangements of atriums in tall office buildings and the production of new ones, engage the politics of workplace away from introversion, cellularization, and standardization to transparency, communication, and complexification, or by making different choices regarding the assembly of galleries in a museum to alter the conventions associated with viewing of art. By choosing to interrupt conventions, architects not only ground architecture in the micropolitics of everyday life rather than ideals, they also ensure that the built environment is in a state of constant change and develops as a multiplicity.
Okay, I'm Andrew Witt, for those of you who are not familiar with me. So my research grew out of challenges that I encountered in practice at the intersection of architecture, analysis, and construction. So in particular, in the context of industrialized and automated building, these challenges highlighted the need for a more systematic research project on the connection between geometry, machines, and construction material. So in particular, I'll cite two examples from prior experience. The first is a project by Frank Gehry that's going to be opening this month in Paris, the Fondation Louis Vuitton. The second is the Al Bahar Towers, a project that's been open for a couple years now in Abu Dhabi. So this first project has a facade consisting of about 300 or 3,500 individually formed curved glass panels. So for this project, I and my collaborators essentially developed mathematical techniques to model and simulate the forming of that glass and to make use of an unusual fabrication process. So this is a machine which is actually more typically used in auto manufacture, auto prototyping. It can precisely curve in an industrial way glass to a specific cylindrical radius. So with that, we were able to actually construct that facade in a sort of mass customized way using this unusual material. Second example is the Al-Bahar Towers by MDesS Architects. In this instance, we consulted on the development of a unitized folding facade panel that adapts dynamically to shade two large glass towers. Not merely skin deep, the effects of this system allow significant savings in cooling costs. So I worked to simulate the highly customized kinematics and prepare that for CNC fabrication. So as one might imagine, these projects required the ad hoc creation of new mechanical, material, and mathematical techniques. The challenges of these projects convinced me that the expanded possibilities for architecture were bound up with the changing arithmetic of industrial economy. At the same time, my historical research began to reveal a certain deep history of systematic geometry in architecture, which remained as sort of a collection of archipelagos of individual experiments. So far from a narrative continuity, this history actually was a kind of folklore, and tying that story together became a priority for me. So that whole history involves not only designers, but also visual experimentalists, such as the German architectural photographer Heinrich Heidersberger, who built room-sized photographic apparatus to draw what are in effect virtual spaces. So my research at the GSD extends this work through a geometry lab, founded to pursue funded research, as well as affiliated course and thesis work. So on the one hand, that means pushing the limits of form within selected architectural constraints, and on the other hand, it means literally rethinking making at the nuts and bolts level. So the seed of this research is a rigorous investigation into the natural limits of constructible form. So in that sense, we start with a very limited set of construction requirements. So for example, what can you make with flat, planarized quad panels, and then essentially elaborate that vocabulary into a formal range of, into a formal lexicon, a catalog of forms, if you will. So some of the resulting models are actually archived as a sort of library of proto-architecture, a resource map to the range of constrained form. In this collection, I intend to sort of add software produced at the GSD and also machines as well, as you'll see in just a minute. So the way that process and operation interrelate also became things that also, as part of this process, became part of fell into the purview of the designer. So they became a key element of this research as well. So I have directed research seminars for the last couple of years, essentially around creating custom machines to produce and manipulate material architectural effects. Here we see a first example. This is a sheet metal tool which is being incrementally formed using a custom constructed hammer and a robotic support device. So this incremental forming actually gives the sheet metal a unique kind of design rigidity. We also investigate materials which are sort of more stochastic and soft. So here, using a repurposed laser cutter and a specifically designed glue apparatus, student researchers constructed an inflatable structures printer. So the glue seams actually become the hinges which determine the unique curvature of the structure. The implications extend, obviously, from inflatable structures onto soft robotics and medical applications. And of course, the interplay between kinematics or moving machines and geometry is a special research interest. And this is always guided by the construction of larger scale prototypes. So this thesis explores a unique geometry, not of typical folded planes, but instead of hinged solids, which is an entirely fresh approach to my knowledge. So finally, we have a focus on the possibilities of obviously transforming practice. We engage fabricators, builders, and software companies in joint research projects. One example is a current project with Geometrica, the builder of the sort of interior space frame of Fernando Romero's project on the development of light, site-deployable robotics for freeform space frame construction. So ultimately, this research investigates systematic design methods, but in a way that nevertheless makes space or room for design agency. The research recognizes that, in fact, the burden of proof for possibility rests with the designer, and that the means by which previously unimaginable systems could be realized have never been more abundant. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, every one of you, for these wonderful presentation. 5 minutes, not a lot, but you've conveyed really the full content of what you do. We have a very limited time. We have 5 minutes for a couple of questions, so please feel free to come to the microphone if no question. Okay, I'll have one simply for you all, but you're not all obliged to answer. But I was really struck by the fact that a lot of these researchers associate student, which would lead me to how do you see the future of design education in the light of this growth of research and this kind of massive growth of research? Do you see pedagogical innovation that could stem from research? We spoke about design education in the previous panel, so what would be your take from your research experience? So whoever wants to answer.
I'll take it very quickly. I think it's, I'll just talk about one dimension, perhaps the others can jump in. I think it, most likely what it does, at least for me, it just informs my teaching in many different ways. The teaching that's associated with innovations, as well as how innovations can be related to practice, where students can gain much more experience in those two worlds. And that's one. The other dimension to it is basically the more advanced education, predominantly the Doctor of Design as well as the PhD, where students get to be engaged with research in multiple dimensions. And I think they gain a lot by having in-house type of experience where we connect them with the best, not just at the GSD, but also connect them to the varieties of different schools within the university as well as the rest of the community outside.
Thank you. Anyone?
I just mentioned also that I think the professional landscape is much more diverse than it ever has been in the past, and these opportunities provide a way for students to sort of like carve out essentially a career trajectory that is a little bit more sort of consonant with specific interests. So I think it provides an opportunity actually to jumpstart certain career paths.
Maybe I could. No, I did. So, no, please, after you. Go ahead.
Okay, no time for too much politeness.
Okay, so my comment to that question is that in teaching and pedagogy, we have actually the luxury of a bit of time to step away from aspects of practice, which really do have to move forward at a really quick pace. And so I think for my research, being able to think about the materials library the material decisions which need to happen very quickly, much more objectively is something that we actually can do in a seminar. And
one aspect of the increase in research at the design school has been that students are not only engaged somewhat in it through classes, but there's also actually quite a lot of employment for students. And that is actually part of the multifaceted part of the design school. The design school is not just the faculty teaching courses, it's the extracurricular activities and then the experience that students have in a kind of mentor-mentee relationship through the process of being research assistants. They're often working in teams, and it just gives a much richer experience, a more multifaceted experience of the educational process.
Thank you so much, Anne. Farshid? No.
What the function books try to do is to examine the kind of the diverse elements and materials that have gone into a history of buildings as artifacts, and to analyze them or to examine them in terms of how they also performs through this kind of actual presence. And I think to look at the history of architecture in this way also allows us to be more informed when we are producing our future projects, so that we are not just caught in the business of, well, how many experts do we work with and how many issues do we have to integrate, but also remember that along the history of architecture, we've developed certain know-hows in terms of what's the consequence of putting them together in one way versus the other. Mm-hmm. And I think this kind of architectural knowledge exists in the history of built forms that we accumulate constantly, and I think it's important to look at them and to learn from them. And that's really a kind of a format that we try to pursue as a way to make this kind of research relevant.
Thank you. And conversely, probably your work should trigger some reflections among historians. Michael?
Well, perhaps because my research involves a lot of field work, one of the things that I've become very adamant about is not differentiating sort of the academic or research track from the professional track. And one thing that's really struck me is that so many of I hesitate to call them research assistants because really they're researchers. The people who've been in the field with me have turned that experience on the ground under very challenging circumstances, dealing with some pretty tough issues, into the basis for their professional work after. And that sort of research exposure with tough realities on the ground has, I think, really informed their planning and design practice afterwards. And actually, that maybe reflects why I think I perhaps misunderstood the Bill Cosby clip. I actually was sure, and maybe I just misheard, that actually the person who was the better dancer was actually the student. But that maybe is something that I'm exposed to a lot in the field, where you're on the ground, and I'm constantly struck by the sort of capacity for GSD students to sort of certainly outshine me when it comes to being on the ground.
Okay, don't repeat it too loud. Okay, well, since I've been repeatedly asked to be as concise as possible for the debate, I think we'll wrap up. I'd like to thank you all once again for a wonderful presentation, and thanks.